One of the main species on our property is balsam fir, and this tree died a couple years ago, and when I cut it down it was already fairly dry. But to get even more moisture out of it, I dried it for a couple months in a dry, warm room with a fan blowing at it and a dehumidifier right beside it. Since I don't own a jointer, I had to figure out how to perfectly flatten at least one side of those slabs, and I decided to use a router, and the first thing I needed for that was a slat for the router to slide in. I used a nice piece of 1/4" Baltic birch plywood for the bottom and some scrap pieces for the sidewalls. I pre-drilled everything to avoid splitting, gave it a quick sanding here and there, and screwed everything together. To cut the slot for the router, I used the router itself. Now usually you would use a big corded router for this kind of a job, since it will have much more power to handle a router bit like this for a longer time period. And even though I do own a corded router, I was very curious to see how this little guy would perform. I really like the convenience of battery powered tools, and I recently got a big 8 amp hour battery, so this was a good test to push the boundaries a little bit. Also, I don't have a big flattening router bit. I'm using just a 3/4" plunge bit. That will take a little bit longer, but it will be easy on the tool. Now that the slat was pretty much done, I had to work on the rails for it to slide on. I'm using a melamine particle board as a base. It has the right dimensions for what I'm doing, it's very cheap, and it's flat. For the rails, I decided to use strips of MDF for similar reasons. It is very straight and cheap, but I kind of regretted that later. I don't work very often with this stuff, but this was a good reminder how poorly screws hold in it. And even though I pre-drilled every hole, it started to sort of split. I made it work anyways, and since it was just going to be used for this project, it wasn't that big of a deal after all. Alright, now it was time to get serious. The slab had a slight twist to it, so I had to shim up both ends to make sure there's really no movement in it while I'm doing this. And after 20 minutes of really brutal work for that router, the 8 amp hour battery finally gave up. I finished it off with another battery, and after removing this mountain of sawdust, I was able to take a look at the result. Now this looked great, and at this point I finally decided to use my brain, and instead of trying to chew down 1/2 inch of material just to get closer to the final thickness, I adjusted the router to 1/4 inch, which was plenty to flatten this. I rather used the planer later on to deal with the final thickness. Now with that adjustment, I was able to do the remaining 3 slabs with one fully charged battery, which was quite impressive. I have to admit though, this was the absolute maximum in size that the planer can handle, but I got it done. Now I had to deal with the edges. First I removed some rotten sections in the sapwood with the chainsaw, and then I had to come up with a way to produce a really straight and square edge without a jointer. Now this was quite tricky and took some trial and error to figure out. First I tried to improvise some sort of track saw, but my circular saw can't cut deep enough, and I tried to finish up that cut with a flush cut router bit, but it just didn't leave a good enough surface for a glue up. Eventually I came up with this. I used a bread nailer to attach a strip of wood on the underside of the 3-inch thick board, and the size of that strip fits perfectly in the miter slot of the table saw. Now this way the board is really forced in position, and that left a super clean cut. It also helped to use a brand new table saw blade. The drawback of that is after removing the strip I was left with tiny holes from the bread nails, but that wasn't too big of a deal since it was the underside of the table and the tree had lots of wood worms, so it was barely noticeable anyways. I wanted to keep a live edge on this table. That means I had to peel back the bark without damaging the character of the edge too much. And that step just took forever, but it was well worth the work. Now before I tackle the glue up, I need to make a couple clamping calls. Those are basically two boards that you can clamp across the tabletop, which helps you to align everything. I'm using a chunk of birch that I milled a couple years ago, and I stored it inside the house, so it was very dry. To make those clamps work properly, they need to be slightly tapered on both sides. That leaves you basically with a hump in the middle, which once you clamp them on the left and right side, it also applies enough pressure in the middle. You can use a hand plane or even a sander like this to do the job, and it doesn't need much, maybe a 32nd of an inch on each side. That should be enough. I was running short on clamps, so I decided to drill a hole to the end and use a long bolt as a clamp. Now here's the plan. Glued up tabletops like this will definitely move with seasonal temperature and humidity changes, so I have to make sure it doesn't warp. For that I plan on inserting 2 dovetailed boards across the bottom of the tabletop, wide enough to also serve as attachment point for the legs, and a third one right in the middle. Now the problem here is that this would have kind of ruined the look of the live edge. But if I stop the boards just a couple inches before the edge, I should be able to preserve that look. Now let's take a closer look at the dovetail itself. One of my worries is that the edge here might break out under the pressure of the moving wood, but if I extend the board, I can tuck that edge in and it has nowhere to go. Also, this gives the board more mass to withstand pressure and to hold the screws for the legs. Well, next I clamped everything up temporarily without glue, and now I can start working on that. After cleaning up the edges and sanding everything, I decided to not only rely on a dovetail, but to also use screws to pull the tabletop to those boards. I still had to allow for movement though, or otherwise the wood will just split randomly. For that, the dovetail is cut 3/8 of an inch shorter on each side than the pocket itself, and the screw holes are turned into slots. Alright, I guess I'm ready for the glue up now. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm well over 40 hours now in this project and guess I could ruin it in the matter of half an hour. But I think I prepared myself well enough. I got all the clamps, I got all the parts that I need, and guess I just go for it. Well, I have to wrap it up at this point. We're already in 14 minutes, and to be honest, I'm running short of time. I haven't finished editing the second part. Hello, Charlie. And besides that, this is already a stretch for most people. I live in a world now where long videos like that require a lot of attention span, and people don't have that anymore. So I will come up with the next video soon. I promise it's going to be worth it. Thanks for your patience, and I will see you the next time. Hey, buddy.